Hello and welcome to today's event, everyone. We appreciate you being here. Our event today is called The Surprising Fragility of Procurement Decisions and Why Better Tools Are So Important. My name is Patrick Moore. I'm a senior fellow for the Center for Digital Government, and in a previous life was the CIO for the state of Georgia. I'm excited and honored to serve as a moderator for today's event and want to start off by saying thank you for joining us. We've got a great session ahead of us for the next 60 minutes. We look forward to your questions and hearing what our panelists have to say. We do want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping before the session begins. A recording of this presentation will be emailed to all registrants within 48 hours. You can use the recording for your reference or feel free to pass it along to your colleagues. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and you can participate in the Q&A with us by asking questions at any time during the presentation. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the presentation panel. Please send in your questions as they come up through the presentation. Our speakers will address as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A portion at the close of our webinar. If you'd like to download a PDF of the slides for the presentation, you can do so by clicking the Webinar Resources widget at the bottom of the console. Also, during today's webinar, you'll be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Please use hashtag GovTechLive to connect with your peers across the government technology platform via Twitter. And you can see that at the bottom of the slides as well. At the close of the webinar, we encourage you to complete a brief survey about the presentation. We'd love to hear your opinions. If you're unable to stay with us for the entire webinar, but would like to complete the survey as much as you're able, please click the survey widget at the bottom of the screen to launch the survey. Otherwise, it will pop up once the webinar concludes. At this time, we'd like to recommend that you disable any pop-up blockers you have, and if you're experiencing any media player issues or have any other problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the help button at the bottom of the console. Joining me today on this topic are Corey Flatt, CEO of Bonfire, James Barr, Director of Product Development at Bonfire, and Diane Horvath, Manager of Consulting Procurement at BDO. As CEO of Bonfire, Corey Flatt believes that procurement teams deserve modern, easy-to-use, and inexpensive software to make better, faster decisions. For over 15 years, Corey has worked in software and information technology, giving him real insight into technology and data's ability to provide meaningful solutions to real challenges. James Barr is the Director of Product Development for Bonfire. In his role, James leads a cross-functional team responsible for long-term product strategy and vision. Previously, he held multiple senior roles at Moivision Technologies, developing both hardware and software products, creating intelligent solutions to transportation problems around the globe. Diane Horvath is Manager, Consulting Procurement with BDO, a versatile senior procurement professional and lawyer with over 30 years of legal, government, and business experience. Diane has built an extensive track record of positioning procurement initiatives to deliver business outcomes, enhancing service through process improvements, and collaborating with stakeholders in large, complex environments. I've got a great group here with lots of experience on this topic, and the topic is really quite timely. Over the years, procurement has long been a difficult subject for governments and the industry alike. Industry often says that the procurements don't move quickly enough. And governments oftentimes say that the procurement process is in place to protect taxpayer dollars and the needs of constituents. Over the last couple of years, the dialogue has begun to change as state governments and industry alike are looking for ways to improve the way in which procurements can support both the needs of citizens, these needs which are changing rapidly as technology industries are changing, as well as the way in which governments apply technology to the problems that they have and the challenges that they have. And more we're starting to see that procurements are seen as a strategy, as a linchpin in the implementation of a strategy and implementation of plans, from to a governor's level all the way down to an agency level and the way in which agencies have to implement their mission. First of all, procurements are the starting point for any technology-led strategy. You have to be able to buy goods and services from the marketplace, oftentimes to implement the things and the vision that the governors want, that legislatures ask for, that agencies and other offices need in order to deliver a service. And for so long, procurement's been perceived as a barrier. But governments are spending more time on reforming procurement processes. You're seeing recent partnerships between NASCIO and NASPO, which recently released a paper discussing the state IT procurement process and the negotiations, the way in which they can be improved. You're seeing in the technology press the way in which state government leaders are attempting to break down these barriers and change the way that the market and governments alike perceive the way in which procurements work and try to improve the processes. And ultimately, effective procurements help set the tone for relationships between suppliers and buyers. There's a period of time spent purchasing a good and a service, but there's an even longer period of time spent after a contract is signed in a relationship, in trying to implement and in working together. Setting the tone early, establishing relationships early, and setting a working relationship in the early days of procurement can have long-lasting implications, good or bad, depending on how that tone is set and established. So today, as a segue into how we're going to discuss these topics and what we're going to hear from Bonfire, we have the following agenda mapped out. First, there's going to be a discussion on exploring the shift in procurement, what trends are Bonfire seeing in the marketplace. We're going to see some case study findings and discuss each one of these, which are the decisions involved in key drivers around the fragility of procurements, structured versus unstructured procurements, the weighting of pricing and evaluator bias, all of which anybody would recognize or be involved with if you've touched a procurement. And then finally, the last piece, the impact of next-gen platforms. So with that, and without further ado, why don't we jump into this? And Corey, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick, and thanks for agreeing to moderate the panel. Your experience and your background is uniquely suited for this, so thank you for that. And thank you to the audience for taking some time out of your day. We think this is one of the most important topics for public sector procurement teams to be dealing with, and I think that the fact that we have such a large audience for the topic speaks to the industry as a whole starting to recognize that this is something worth spending time and really looking at what the data actually says. So thanks everyone for being here, and yeah, we're excited to share the content with you. So I'm going to start very briefly with who we are in case people don't know us. So we are a next generation sourcing tool primarily for public sector, and we've been one of the fastest growing tools in the last few years. As you'll see as we go through the content and show you some examples, our tool and our platform helps procurement teams make decisions, and we actually capture that decision-making process or evaluation process far more deeply than first-generation bidding tools or portals, and certainly the larger ERP-like procurement systems out there. So what this means is that we actually have one of the largest, the largest set of digitized RFP evaluation data in the history of public sector procurement. And you'll find that in the last year or so, and increasingly, we're going to be sharing key insights from this data with the industry at large as a way of intensifying the discussion around some of the most important items. And so the topic today, as Patrick introduced, is fragility, and what fragility might mean in a world where procurement is becoming more and more important. As Patrick pointed out, it's never been more important that procurement not only isn't a barrier or a barrier to procuring new technologies and new goods and services, but there's actually an opportunity for it to become a greater strategic partner at the given organization. So counter to that sense of optimism, I want to inject a dose of reality. And the slide that's up speaks exactly to this. So this is from a very large study that Deloitte conducted. And one of the questions that Deloitte asked hundreds of procurement leaders, many, I think more than half of whom were in public sector, one of the questions they asked was, does your team have the necessary skills and tools to deliver on your strategy? So they've asked this question for years, and we're in the low 30s on that, meaning 2/3 of procurement leaders cannot say yes to this question. For a moment, consider other parts of your organization. Consider your CFO is at a board meeting, and a board member turns to him and says, hey, do you have the people, the skills, and the tools to perform on this year's strategy? You hopefully would get a yes, just like in many other functional areas. But within procurement, there is a sense that things are changing, and things are changing rapidly. And against that backdrop, a lot of the processes and tools are not changing. And so what we want to submit today is a relatively simple idea. And that idea is that procurement decisions are more fragile than we often give them credit for, and the solution is actually better tools. And we believe that technology is a way to reverse this trend and to empower procurement teams, specifically in this area, but really to have that strategic place at the table. So we're going to start by looking at what we think is the most important gap is in the competitive procurement process. And then we're going to look at what the data suggests. And so up on your screen, folks, there's 4 circles. And you'll notice that generally this maps out most kind of competitive procurements, bids, tenders, RFPs, things like that. And you'll notice that most of these steps you're already doing in some form digitally and maybe even online, right? So you have templates, maybe Microsoft Word, that you update for a given procurement. You fill in the relevant information. You know, you're using probably a RFP listing site, or maybe you have a web on your own website, your organization's website, you list your RFPs online. And maybe you're being matched to vendors. Maybe you're using an industry tool to help you match your opportunities to vendors publicly. But then we get into supplier selection. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. But at the very end, once the supplier is selected, guess what? You're probably managing your contracts. You probably have an ERP system in place. You probably have electronic tools, even online tools, to do that last part of the process. But what we found across every nook and cranny of public sector is that the vast majority of procurement teams are running relatively offline ad hoc processes for supplier selection. So what do we mean with supplier selection? Well, we mean the act of receiving proposals and supplier data, evaluating that data, and essentially making the final decision. We won't poll the audience. We debated whether we should or not, but we won't. But pretend I am, and raise your hand if so. The vast majority of us on the call today are accepting paper submissions from suppliers and evaluating those submissions in Excel, offline, and worse, paper, right? Like not just offline, but not even digital. And so what we want to submit to you today, folks, against this backdrop of procurement has never been more important, but there's this growing sense that we're behind and we're getting more and more behind. We want to submit to you the idea that fixing this circle, fixing the way that supplier selection decisions are made, and specifically in a way that defeats their fragility, this is a huge part of the path forward for public sector. Right. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Andy, who's going to introduce the case study. We're going to look at specific forms of fragility, what that means, and how to combat that and discuss it as a panel. So go ahead, Andy.
Thank you very much, Corey. That really brings us to the meat of today's session, what we're most excited to be sharing with our audience today. And that's really the fragility and the case study that we conducted in order to discover and uncover that, and allow us to better identify and better understand what in some cases are surprising sources of decision fragility in procurement. So in examining these sources, we conducted a case study that involved over $3 billion in RFP projects. So we're not including the most simple bid projects in this count. And these projects were also conducted at over 120 organizations, and that's across a wide spectrum of products and services. And ultimately, the size and scope of this project and this case study gave us insight into thousands of scoring outcomes. And that really allowed us to zero in on the sources of fragility in decisions. So we're going to jump right in here. And the first question that we asked ourselves to try and better understand this fragility was about how the level of structure in a project impacted the performance and outcome of that project. So put another way, what is the relationship between a project structure? So here we're talking about the number of documents requested from vendors, the number of criteria we're using for scoring, how many evaluation stages we've set up, and so on. The relationship between those levers and also how the project unfolded. So we're talking about things like the duration of the project, how long did it take to run, the initial level of consensus among our evaluators and our scoring spread. So what I'm going to do now is to give you a bit more additional context here. I'd like to show you a few quick examples of structured versus unstructured projects. And I'm going to use Bonfire to do this and really try and illustrate for you what that difference looks like. So what we're looking on screen here is an example of a project that's been run in Bonfire. You can think of this view as a mission control for this particular project. So everything about the way that the project has been configured, managed, and run is all done from this view. And this is where I, as a buyer, I've configured the structure of my project. So what I'm talking about here is controlling what information and how much of it I'd like to get from my vendors, who's going to be evaluating what their scoring criteria is going to be, and so on. So here we've got another view here, just flipping ahead, and this is an example of where some of this configuration has already taken place. What we're seeing on screen is an example of an RFP that's been set up using a low amount of structure. So what we can immediately see is that we've got two very broad requests from our vendors. We've got a proposal PDF, and we've also got a pricing document. And from the visual timeline at the top, that blue section means that our evaluation team is currently scoring these two data sets using a minimal number of criteria. In this case, we've got a rated score out of 10 for the proposal and a price score. And I just want to emphasize at this point, there's nothing hidden here. There is only two criteria. There's nothing nested below that. This is a very simple, very low structure product, probably its most simple form. Now, contrasting to this, on screen is an example of a more sophisticated, a more highly structured project in Bonfire. So in this case, we can see that vendors are being asked literally hundreds of specific and very narrow focused questions. And these have been organized into sets of questions and criteria groups. So within each of these questions, there are even subsets of questions nested below that as well. So my goal here is using these examples, it becomes very easy for us to understand and see the difference between these structured and unstructured projects, but also to see where the data is coming from the insights that we're about to share with you. So Corey, can you take us at this point and share the insights that we've discovered through this case study on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this will probably confirm what a lot of people would guess with this very authoritative set of data. So I think we're confirming one of the beliefs you might already have in the audience. And what the data very clearly indicates is that yes, the higher the structure, the better. So in other words, the higher the structure, the faster the projects are completed, the clearer the final decision is, and the happier stakeholders are. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this finding as how did we bucket, there's 8,000 projects. How did we bucket these projects? How did we decide what was what? So first of all, across the 8,000 projects, we defined structured as RFPs that had a request for 10 distinct pieces of data from suppliers. So these could be data fields or specific documents, 15 or greater criteria that they're being evaluated against, and at least 3 or more stages of evaluation. So the common pattern, of course, is first we're going to check mandatory requirements, then we're going to check technical requirements, and then finally we'll check pricing. So just over half of the 8,000 projects actually fell into this category. And that's largely because tools like Bonfire make it very easy for teams to run highly structured projects. Is the reason that number is so high. On the flip side, we also looked at that 8,000 projects and bucketed the unstructured projects. And you can see it's essentially the inverse of the first numbers. And about 26% of the 8,000 projects were unstructured. And by the way, if you're astute, you'll notice that doesn't add up to 100. Well, the remainder had attributes of both, so they weren't clearly classified one way or another. But folks, look at the results. Structured projects, 32% faster. We're talking about weeks saved. Twice as much agreement as unstructured, meaning evaluators, when they're answering questions and evaluating more tightly defined criteria, tend to agree more than the more open-ended, broad criteria where there's more room for ambiguity. This was a surprise. There's a greater scoring spread on structured projects, meaning more separation is created between the first and the third place vendor. And folks, this is thousands and thousands of RFPs in this data. This isn't a handful. This is solid, statistically valid data. What was really interesting with the last 2 points, and then we can get the panel's read on these findings, but what was really interesting with these last two is we didn't actually set out to measure this directly. How did stakeholders feel about structured versus unstructured projects? But anecdotally, as we conducted the case study, our clients asked us, hey, are you tracking this? And Bonfire does allow for the tracking of this information. So after the fact, we were able to go back and see if happiness of vendors and evaluators was correlated with structure. And it really, really is. Vendors like having a tight list of requirements that they need to fill. Evaluators like being asked specific questions to engage with versus very open-ended value judgments. The conclusion here, folks, is extremely clear. It's important to have as much structure as you can, and again, within reason, and I think as a panel we'll discuss, what that means, an appropriate amount. But the results speak for themselves, and tools like Bonfire make it easy for teams to structure and run these decisions.
So at this point, we'd like to hand back to Patrick for our panel.
Yeah, thanks. Certainly, these are some really compelling findings. And I think what's interesting, in my experience, certainly you're hard pressed to find a procurement team that won't say that their process is structured. And so I'm curious to hear your insights, and hopefully the audience is as well here, on what are some of the reasons why a procurement team wouldn't have made their projects more structured? Is it just that they feel like they have enough structure today, or maybe they think it's too burdensome? What are some of the reasons that you've seen in your data gathering?
I can take a first stab at this. This is James from Bonfire. I think when I look at this, whether we're talking about procurement or even more broadly just work, I think we all know that the ways that we do our work can always be improved, and I think that's what we go in to do 9 to 5 every day, to make ourselves a little bit better, or our processes a little bit better than they were before. But just like it's difficult as an individual to put the time into, I'm going to start keeping better lists and keeping myself more organized as opposed to running things ad hoc like I've done in the past. That's difficult to do because it involves changing my way of doing things every day. And then when I look at a procurement team trying to improve their process, we see a collection of people who have a whole bunch of things that, in the status quo might be, there's, Excel templates that we've built and macros that we've written, and there are binders and binders of paper, and all this stuff works. So I agree, there's a structure to it, but improving that structure is really difficult because there's a lot of hard copies of things to change. And when changing all of that stuff isn't the top priority on the list, it's really easy to just go with the status quo because it works okay. However, being able to make this change faster allows you to make these kinds of results.
Patrick, I want to
that makes
add
a lot of sense. Go ahead, Diane.
Yes, Patrick, this is Diane adding a little bit to James's answer. I've had the benefit of seeing procurement and procurement processes across Canada and the U.S., so I can say that universally, at least in 2/3 of North America, I think the reason that procurement teams do not have more structure in their process and requirements is really a lack of time. You have to know what you want to get to the granular level that you even saw in the slideshow that Andy showed us on how the data was derived. You have to be able to really dive in, understand your business outcomes that you're trying to achieve through your procurement process, and then break that down into really small bites that a vendor can understand and that you as the buyer, that it will really add up to what you're trying to acquire as a good or service in the first place. So I think not enough planning time is allocated to the development and identification of requirements, and that leads to the unstructured nature of many of the RFPs that I participated in as a public sector employee in the U.S. and in Virginia, as well as what I've seen in Canada since being north of the border for 10 years. So another piece of this is I don't think procurement teams generally take enough time to consider whether they're going out for something that's brand new and they really need to ask the market to give us a solution. And in Virginia, I worked with the technologies agency that was created some years ago, and we changed the procurement rules so that we could go out for solutions-based procurement rather than requirements-based, so that particularly in IT projects where you don't know what you want, you don't know how the market is moving, you are much more unstructured in your requests. So I think there's a time and place for unstructured RFPs, but the procurement team really has to take the lead and exercise leadership with the business units on how to make that distinction.
Yeah, so thanks everybody. That mirrors our thinking, almost perfectly, Diane. We were in full agreement, and I think the how question is interesting, or the what, how is this happening? But just to conclude on this section, I think the real headline here is structure matters, right? It's worth the effort. And okay, tools can make that effort easier, but it's worth it. Clear, faster decisions. We talk about fragility. The vaguer things are, the more fragile your decisions are, the more possible you're going to get challenged on vendor debrief, bid protest, an audit. It's really in everyone's best interest to do more of the work up front, and tools can make that easier. Absolutely. Okay, so over back to you, Andy, for the next source of fragility or analysis. Go ahead.
Great, thanks, Corey. Yeah, that was a great panel discussion. I'm excited to hear your guys' thoughts on this next question. So really, this next question in the case study started to explore what the sensitivity of project outcomes was and that final vendor selection with the weighting of pricing as part of that project. So using our $3 billion of RFP data, we ran an analysis, and essentially what that did was indicate if the final vendor selection for each RFP within that case study would change by varying the weighting of price by as little as 5%. So, of course, price is just one part of the balanced scorecard, and it really just represents part of the balance between that qualitative analysis of your potential suppliers and the pricing or the value of those vendors as well. So I'm just going to quickly show some quick examples here of that balance using products in Bonfire to highlight exactly where our data has been coming from. So here we've got a quick example showing a balanced scorecard for a project that's being run for retreat venues. And although this is perhaps a more simple example, we can see how the buyer has configured this project with qualitative criteria, so we can see history of similar projects, along with their product offering as well, so a range of activities and meeting room selection. And there's also a pricing component here where 30% of the overall vendor score, and that's a pretty typical weighting for price. Now, while evaluators are conducting their scoring, those scores are being captured and stored and recorded in real time. So as the buyer managing this project, I can immediately dive in and see how my evaluation is unfolding. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. On screen is a scoring summary for the same retreat venue project. So this is giving me a bird's eye view of how my scoring has unfolded, where each vendor was competitive, but also the impact that the quoted pricing they provided has had on their overall competitiveness. So what you're seeing on the right-hand side there is the scoring based on their price. And what I really want to highlight here is currently the winning supplier, the leading supplier, has 30 points for pricing. As we mentioned earlier, that was the weighting. But imagine that was 40%. Now what happens to my competitive spread? What happens if that becomes 50%? That's really what we're trying to do here. That's the question we're trying to answer, is how sensitive is this outcome to the weighting that we're applying to price? So Corey, in this example, we can see how pricing can have that massive effect. Can you guide us through some of the case study findings?
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, this one's a doozy. There is substantial impact from very small changes to how you weight price. And again, I think talk to an experienced buyer, I think this is probably what you would guess or have gleaned through your experience, but we can definitively prove this today. So yes, final decisions are very dependent on what price is set to. And we're going down a little bit of a deeper data analysis channel here, folks, so please bear with me. We tried to make it relatively digestible and clear, but we'll talk through it here. So what we're looking at on the left of this slide is essentially a graph showing the percentage of RFPs in this case study that would have a different winner if the price weight for that given project was plus or minus the values on the bottom. So Andy just showed us an example of that had a typical kind of event RFP location weighting for price of 30%. So essentially what this is saying, folks, is if that wasn't 30%, if that was 40% or 20%, so plus or minus 10%, 25% of these 8,000 RFPs would have a different winner. A different supplier will have won. Now, ask yourself, why did the teams pick 30% and not 40%? And did they necessarily give that decision the weight that it should have, given how sensitive this lever is? We're going to talk about this as a panel, so I don't want to jump ahead too much here. But folks, it's really worth going deep on setting pricing weight appropriately. And in some jurisdictions, you have free hand to change this after you've issued the RFP. In some jurisdictions, you don't have free hand to change the weighting of price. So getting it right at the beginning, along with the balance of the other factors, is extremely important. I won't go through all of the different examples here. Obviously, different commodities have different sensitivities. But folks, 15%, the difference between a 25% weighted price and a 40% price. 1 in 3 of your RFPs are different. You probably have RFPs running right now that have some of these weightings that maybe were decided somewhat arbitrarily. As a source of fragility, this is a big one. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the panel discussion's like next.
So with that in mind, we'll hand it back to Patrick for the panel.
Yeah, thanks. Again, some really insightful data, and certainly price is always a huge topic in any government procurement. People asking questions about procurement from outside the organization are wondering, why didn't you go with the cheapest provider, where these are taxpayer dollars, et cetera, et cetera. But especially when you're dealing with technology, you start to see different types of ways in which price is used. Should this be a best value procurement where you're focused more on a solution? Or is it a commodity type service where price can play a bigger part in a final decision? So I'm curious, what are y'all seeing in your market research? How are the procurement professionals selecting their pricing weights for the projects when they go to market?
I think, Patrick, I'll start off with that. This is Diane, and now that I've switched over to the consulting side, and I spend a lot of time trying to help the provincial and local governments here in Ontario with these issues, I think there is a misconception, and I would say I saw this in the U.S. in my experience in Virginia as well. There's a misconception among more senior management levels, executive levels in a lot of public sector organizations that if you set the pricing weight high, you'll get a better price, and you will get the lowest price with the quality that you want. And that's a misconception that I think has been around for a long time and is now thankfully becoming a part of the discussion, because we've actually developed a model, and I'm laughing because we use an Excel spreadsheet to do it, and I think Bonfire's figured out a way to actually do these algorithms right within their product. So when I've worked with it and seen it in action, I think it's our spreadsheet which most of us really on our team can't even do, but it's a pretty complex thing, but you run these scenarios, and that takes some skill and some knowledge to sit down with your CIO, your business unit, your director, and say, okay, you want me to put this out at 40% pricing weight, and let me show you what that does across other factors, and let me run this model for you and show you exactly what Corey's talking about, how outcomes would be different. And as you mentioned, Patrick, if you're buying purple widgets, it might not matter. But if you're buying a brand new technology, you're establishing a one contact with government through call center, web, IVR. You know, these are brand new things hitting the front line of service delivery for government, and maybe you don't want the cheapest, and maybe you want to understand what changing that price factor up or down 10-15% is really going to get you in the long run. So I think when I see procurement professionals, again, and I'm seeing it on both sides of the border, a lot of it is just the status quo being maintained in terms of the thinking, and not really being able to understand what a difference price makes in the weighting that you set. On the vendor side, I'll just say, for us at BDO Canada, when we are going to respond to a service or to an RFP, pretty much now, if anything is over 25% pricing evaluation weighting, we're not going to bid it. We just don't want to get lowballed. We've got a lot of qualifications, and we know that pricing is going to switch that outcome in a way that we're probably going to lose. So you have to think about that effect on your marketplace as well. There are vendors now that are just going to walk away from bidding that are probably your best vendors, but you're eliminating them by setting the pricing weighting just too high.
Yeah, and I think that speaks, this is Corey again, I think that speaks to almost the heart of the issue, right? Which is, it's very difficult to set this properly. And, you know, you struggle. There's no real shortcuts for this, right? You have to engage with senior stakeholders, as Diane said, you know, and balance what they think it should be with the business objectives. You need to do research. You know, what traditionally have you done? What templates are out there? But at the end of the day, it starts with the recognition that that this is a very important decision that you make relatively early on in a procurement life cycle, and it has a lot of power after the fact. And look, folks, again, obviously, right, next generation tools are very helpful here. They're helpful on the front end for discussing with stakeholders, doing research, you know, seeing what, you know, essentially deciding on what the pricing weight should be. So tools like Bonfire can help with that. And then they can also help on the back end to allow you to do essentially a what if. You know, what if we did have pricing that higher or lower? Would that change the outcome? So next generation tools can absolutely help here, but for us, the most important finding here is it's almost like a reminder to everybody that this is one of the most important decisions you make when it comes to an RFP. It is not a route decision. It is not a decision that you can just look at your previous history of how you might price this or score price on this particular service. It really bears looking at each individual RFP with fresh eyes in a highly structured way from the beginning. Okay, so why don't we move to the final one? This is one of my favorites, so I'm itching to get to it. Go ahead, Amy.
Absolutely, no pressure then, Corey. Yeah, the final question is really exciting, and really this final source of fragility that we want to explore is really centered on evaluators conducting scoring, and specifically, do evaluators have persistent dispositions or that might impact the decision process? Essentially, what we wanted to uncover here were the behaviors or dispositions of individual evaluators and really try to understand what this means for your project outcomes, should they be participating in your specific RFP project. So in order to do this, we examined evaluators who had conducted a minimum number of scores and a minimum number of projects, and we analyzed their scoring patterns. So here we've got an example on screen that shows an evaluator conducting their scoring in Bonfire. In this case, the evaluator is reading through a PDF proposal, and they're applying scoring justifications as they go along. We can see a few of their previous scores, so for things like history of similar experience or staff technical ability, as well as the implementation plan that they are currently scoring out of 10. Now, as everyone on the call knows, I'm sure, your evaluators aren't always going to agree, but being able to see and understand why your evaluators lack consensus can allow you to really zero in on these potential trouble spots, and that's what we're seeing here. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, evaluator scores and justifications within Bonfire are captured and recorded in real time. And this is important because it enables our users to access insights like what we're seeing on screen. Really what we're seeing here is a scoring summary for an evaluation group. And the key area I want to draw your attention to are the cells that are highlighted in orange. And what these represent are areas where our evaluation team has lacked consensus. In that magnifying glass area, we see an example where two evaluators provided relatively high scores. We have an 8 out of 10 and a 10 out of 10. Well, one of our evaluators gave a low score, a 2 out of 10. Now, Bonfire isn't necessarily going to know who's right or who's wrong here, but it can flag this lack of agreement and allow you as a buyer to see and understand what's impacting your final selection. So when we talk about sources of fragility, and we talk about evaluator dispositions, this is really the question we're trying to ask. Is Michael a reviewer who generally gives a lot of 10s? Is he very positive? On the other hand, is Renata just generally a hard score? Is this something that's typical of her evaluating pattern? So, Corey, based on the over 8,000 evaluator scores that we analyzed, can you take us through what we discovered about evaluators' persistent dispositions?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to correct you briefly, it's 8,000 projects, right? And the average evaluation group, I think, was 4 or 5 members, right? So we're talking about almost 50,000 unique, oh no, sorry, far more than that. But, you know, the number of unique evaluations and scores is in the high tens of thousands that went into this. And here's the reality, folks. Evaluators have dispositions. And as we'll talk about in the panel, this isn't the end of the world. And in fact, it may be a good thing. But let's reflect the reality. Absolutely, evaluators tend to be bucketed into certain categories. And so we have the distribution of these 50,000, 60,000 evaluators who were in this case study thrown up on the screen there. And so what we did is we essentially bucketed them into types. And so we'll start in the bottom left. Cynics. These are evaluators who consistently score negatively compared to the average evaluator. So what does that mean? Consistently means in a narrow band of scores. So imagine imagine a 10-point scoring scale. A cynic might score almost all of his scores between a 2 and a 5, let's say, but consistently in a narrow band. Let's move up a quadrant to the upper left. We call these types of evaluators true believers. They're optimists. They are not only very positive, they are very consistently positive. So these people's natural kind of range for what they evaluate is high. Maybe it's 8, 9, 10. It varies obviously where the dot is plotted. Move to the bottom right. We call these folks pragmatists. So now we're seeing a wider distribution of scores. They may be willing to give some 5s and some 4s along with giving 8s and 10s, but it still skews negatively compared to the average. And the upper right, we have what we call romantics. And this is optimists, but who nevertheless can reflect and give negative scores too. So listen, folks, these are kind of fun names for a phenomenon that I think every single one of us who's been involved in RFP can put real kind of anecdotal experience behind. Evaluators are different. They can look at the same data, score it on the same criteria, and come to different conclusions. And in fact, this is part of the power of RFPs. But this is also what makes them difficult. And this is also a source of fragility. So a typical RFP that you're running right now, according to this data, will have a mix of these types. And at the end of it, someone needs to take all of that data and make sure that you're making the objectively best choice for the objectively right reasons. And that is where the complexity comes in. So if most of us are running complex kind of Excel score sheets that we're distributing, and then only collecting it, right before we get everybody in a room to make a decision, there's not a huge amount of time to actually go through that. And we may just end up spending a lot of time arguing in the room. But with next generation tools like Bonfire, where the scores are recorded in a central place, and we can automatically highlight areas of agreement and disagreement, and you can actually see the justification right in front of you, it allows this source of fragility to become something else. And we're going to talk about that as a panel. But really, folks, this should really give you pause. In today's escalating climate, right, you're getting asked more and more to debrief with vendors. Your criteria are being pressed on. Your auditors are probably getting more active. We see this story all across the States, all across Canada, actually even in Europe. You're being asked to justify your decisions to a greater degree. And when those decisions are based on subjective, differing opinions, man, you need a really strong audit trail and a really good analytics kind of backbone to be able to make that case firmly.
Okay, and so we'd like to pass it back to Patrick for the panel.
Yeah, thanks again. This is such an important characteristic of any team and any procurement that you go through. I think we all know and don't expect that we can eliminate dispositions. Somebody had a bad day or somebody doesn't like a particular solution. But it sounds to me like you're trying to at least bring that out into the open and help procurement teams understand the way in which somebody perceived a particular solution and how that might be compared with others in the group, and maybe something was missed, maybe that person was right. I think we all agree that it's human nature for evaluators to have dispositions. How are you suggesting that this type of data can be used and the tool sets can be used in measuring the way in which people are viewing a solution and the way that they're scoring? And maybe, Diane, we start off with you.
Okay. Well, I think for me, and this was a pretty eye-popping conclusion. I'm a lawyer by trade and training, at least out of the U.S. And we spent a lot of time when I was in Virginia on conflict of interest forms, disclose different things. Clean desk policies, just everything that you can try to physically do to make the process as clean as possible, conflict-free, litigation-proof, complaint-proof. And at the end of the day, it really does boil down to individual evaluators and how you as a procurement team or me as the executive accountable for this big RFP, this big multi-million-dollar project, how do we stand up to a question about whether in fact it was a clean process, fair, open, transparent, and to see this kind of data, and I've never seen anything like it before. I reviewed the white paper that Bonfire prepared, and it really was eye-opening. So for me, it was like, okay, so if I'm sitting there now and I'm advising a client or I'm back in a public agency, what does it mean for me? And I think part of it is that I would go back to planning and developing a realistic schedule, because one of the things that I think the Bonfire data is suggesting is it takes longer, perhaps, when you have lots of different, you have all these dispositions, all these archetypes in your evaluation team. So it takes longer to come to consensus. And I don't think that's a bad thing. So, I typically work on projects that are 12 to 18 months. So if most of that 12 to 18 months is spent on a lot of administrative things, and we can now shift the time away from administration and actually into that consensus meeting and really duke it out and really find out why people are scoring an 8 and why Renee in the example is scoring a 2. Like, I don't mind spending time on that. I think that's what the process is designed to do, and is a valuable use of that 12 to 18 months. It's better than managing Excel spreadsheets or trying to close up your desk and make sure people don't see the submissions that have come in. I'd rather spend time in that evaluation consensus meeting, and because for me, my experience is that consensus meetings tend to be the start of change management for actually implementing the project. It doesn't even matter who the vendor is that's coming in. You have key stakeholders in these on these evaluation teams, people that are going to be very affected by whatever the technology is or whomever the vendor is. And for me, in the positions that I've held, and I see it now in my consulting role, it really is the start of change management. So I don't think we can use artificial intelligence to or big data to eliminate dispositions, human disposition in the evaluation teams. But I think now that we see it very clearly in terms of the data and what it shows, there are ways to use that to make the process even better than what we have.
That's an awesome point, Diane. This is James just jumping in because I want to extend on what you're saying there. I mean, really, and to keep this brief because I know we're getting a little short on time here, but I think ultimately data like this and a process like this lets us take advantage of those human dispositions as opposed to, be afraid of them and really start that process of change you're talking about. So it lets us make sure that our teams are actually balanced and then use that to justify our decisions.
Actually, James, you made a comment to me just as we were running through this. You said, great, you have a balanced scorecard. So what if you don't have a balanced evaluation committee, right? And I thought that was really insightful. So sorry for taking your words out of your mouth, but I think that's a great way to think about it. It's diversity of opinion is like why we run RFPs, right? And it's part of the process. We just need the tools in place to understand differences and justifications and kind of make sausage out of the somewhat kind of messiness in the middle.
Sometimes that cynical hard marker is just a cynic, but sometimes that cynic is actually the best person to catch some technical detail that no one else is going to pick up on.
Yeah, great point. Okay, folks, so we're going to start the Q&A soon, very soon, but let's just conclude here. So just to zoom all the way back out, right? It's never been more important that procurement teams find a way to have a seat at the strategic table. And in public sector, this is incredibly important in the next, 3, 5, 10 years as our agencies go through such change. But these sources of fragility are there. And when you think about your process and you think about how paper and Excel-based, one of the most important parts of this process, supplier selection is, and how fragile that these decisions are, and these are just 3 examples that we're looking at today. I mean, we could do a weekly webinar looking at different sources of fragility. When you think about all of that, I think it really does point to the need for a next generation set of tools that help with supplier selection. And I'll turn it over to Andy. We're obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, but we're the leading next generation sourcing tool for public sector. And take it away, Andy. I know.
Yeah, just before Patrick jumps into the Q&A, I'd be remiss or in trouble for not mentioning that, anything you've seen today, whether it's the concepts or the way we approach procurement, or even specifically through the screenshots you've seen today, if any of that resonates with you or excites you about this new way of doing procurement, I really encourage you to get in touch with us. We're more than happy to take you through our software tool, show you what your project would look like in Bonfire. I don't think it'd be a waste of your time to do that. So if any of that resonates with you, I'd highly encourage you to do that. With that being said, I'd like to pass things over back to Patrick for our Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks, y'all. And this has been a great panel, and I'm looking forward to some questions here. We've got a few minutes left. Hopefully we can get through for 1 or 2. But what I'd like to do quickly is just remind everybody, first of all, that that you're going to get a copy of the presentation for those who are here on the phone with us. Within the next 48 hours, Government Technology is going to provide all attendees with a link to the recording. And you can use that for your own reference or share it with colleagues. And also, just really quick, thanks to everybody on the panel. And thanks to Bonfire for sponsoring today's event. I think this has been great for everybody. So with that, we'll jump into some questions here. And one that's come in is, is about how to change a new platform and how to sell a new platform internally. So the question is, we currently use SAP to conduct all of our procurement, so adopting a new software platform is difficult to sell internally. How should I approach getting a new platform sold internally?
Yeah, hi folks. So this is Corey again. In case you don't recognize my voice after an hour of me talking. But no, so this is a great question, and it's actually one that we answer almost daily. So really, the classic answer is that, of course, you have an existing procurement system. You know, maybe it's part of your ERP system, maybe it's SAP, maybe it's one of the other countless procure-to-pay suites that are out there. There's something in place already. But the fact remains that despite the existence of that system, people are predominantly making decisions offline in Excel and paper. And so usually our explanation and the kind of value proposition is really strong. If your SAP system can help you get to next generation decision making, absolutely you should be doing that in your current system. However, speaking as folks who do this day in, day out, who have integrated with some of these systems, it doesn't exist. You need dedicated tools for this part of the process. So generally, just speaking as Bonfire as an example, yeah, we do generally replace the legacy kind of bidding platforms that are out there for disseminating RFPs and things like that. But really the focus is on receiving files and data electronically and evaluating it. And the value proposition is so strong, not just for the reasons we talked about today, but for time-saving reasons, for compliance reasons, for all of this. It's gonna sound bad, I know, but this is an easy sell when you're armed with the right data. You're not just trying to replace SAP with another big bloated system that you got to climb a mountain to convince people internally. You're really just moving out of paper and Excel for the most important part of this process, and the data very clearly helps you make that case. So, I mean, like I said, we do this every single day. Happy to talk about this offline. And actually, frankly, this is part of the changing landscape of procurement. It's not all just these huge, extremely expensive monolithic systems anymore. There's room for other tools that help you get the job done.
Great, thanks, Corey. And I think let's try to squeeze in one more here. We've got a couple minutes. So one question that's come in is does Bonfire provide automated evaluation? And if so, do you need an evaluation panel if Bonfire does evaluation itself?
Yeah, James here. I can jump on this one pretty quick. So what we do with Bonfire, the intent is not to simply run an automated evaluation, but it's to make it easier for the evaluation team to do what they do best. So when we look back at some of this data around, the types of personas that evaluators exhibit, we want to make it easier for those people to get together and make the valuable decisions. And the things that Bonfire as a platform does really empowers them to do the more value-driven activities as opposed to spending their time filling in spreadsheets or putting stuff together. And so we actually do allow things like automated scoring, where evaluators and project managers can actually set up the way we're going to score and then quickly run through, do auto scoring for the questions that are quantitative, and then let evaluators come together and do what they do best, which is look at the qualitative things and come to consensus.
Yeah, and just in case this question wasn't asked with the idea that Bonfire provides evaluation services, no, absolutely not. We're a software company. We're providing the tools. You guys provide your internal staff. The expertise, you got it. So we, you don't hire us to run or evaluate an RFP. You hire our software to make you more compliant, happier stakeholders, et cetera. Now, interestingly, you might hire Diane and BDO to help you evaluate RFPs, but Bonfire is just software.
All right, y'all, I think that we are at the top of the hour. I want to be respectful of our time commitment here. A big thanks to Corey Flatt, James Barr, Diane Horvath and Andy Baskerville, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks to Bonfire for their sponsorship of this event, and certainly thanks to all of those in the audience for taking the time to join us. And you will be able to receive a copy of this presentation within 48 hours. So thanks to all, and look forward to the next one.